Today's webinar presenter is Chief Paul Schultz. Paul is the current Chief of Police in Canyon City, Colorado. In his 40-plus years of law enforcement, Paul has served over 20 years as Chief of Police in several different departments, including the Director of the Colorado Peace Officers Standards and Training Board. Paul also serves as a Lead My Legacy faculty member, and he graduated with a degree, a master's in administrative justice and a bachelor's in criminal justice administration and management. Chief Schultz, thank you for joining us here today. At this time, I'm going to hand it over to you so you may begin your presentation.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Glad to be here. Our purpose today is to take a look at things, conduct, situations that we can avoid or handle strategically to ensure that we don't have a personal failure that will shorten our careers. We're going to take a look at internal policies, training, oversight, and responsibility for personal actions as well. First item we're going to take a look at is excessive force. And by this, I don't mean excessive force by the administrator or the commander. I'm talking about excessive force within the agency. And the first item, first bullet point we need to take a look at is there a department policy in place that is adequate, or do we have a situation where I refer to it as inadequate policy? Are there controls? Are there separate reporting mechanisms for situations where force is used, a resistance report, if you will? Is that tracked? Do we train to de-escalate force, which is absolutely critical? Do we reward officers for de-escalation of force? The last thing we want to have happen is what's known as a culture of violence. We don't want the agency to be known as a culture of violence. Next, is there an early warning system? Today say that if an agency does not have an EWS, an early warning system in place, that there could certainly be a problem with the contemporariness of that agency. It needs to have that EWS in place. I know we have got one that we've developed and have made available to IACP. If anybody would like a copy of that, please contact me. Is there an adequate less lethal program in place? There's several different types of less lethal force that can be used today. We're not advocating one over another, but we're saying at least have 2 or 3 options available in that less lethal category. Is there adequate training in the use of force? Absolutely critical as well. Are we complying with state standards, national mandates, this type of thing? We've actually taught agencies that have told us that they only make it to the range once a year, once every other year. Clearly, once every other year is inadequate. Are we administrators taking command responsibility for that? In other words, are we doing the right thing and making that an internal affairs issue? Are we dealing with that fairly? Are we taking advantage of training opportunities to both prevent it and to remediate that when that occurs? And last, but certainly not least, tracking of data. Do we track data on use of force? If I were to ask any of the administrators, commanders that are listening, what is the amount of force used in your agency for the last 3 years, based on a trend analysis, is it up or down? If you're having trouble finding that data, you might want to revise your thought process on how to obtain that. That's absolutely critical. And we're moving to the next slide here. Next, again, personal responsibility, misuse of funds, cars, and expense accounts. The best phrase here to sum this up would be failure to exercise good judgment. We certainly want to ensure that we do not engage in questionable practices. Are we self-monitoring our own policy? As administrators, most of us are issued vehicles. Do we have a clear understanding of what the guidelines are on the use of those cars? Can they be used for personal matters, and to what degree? The best example I can think of, if you're assigned a car for personal use, are you allowed to stop in at a restaurant for dinner that serves alcohol? Perhaps that's more of a bar than a restaurant. It needs to be clarified with your employer. All of the accounts today, expense accounts, are public records, and often I hear police chiefs tell me that their personal expense accounts are being audited, and clearly what they're looking for is not if you had dessert or an appetizer, but these watchdog groups are obviously looking to see if you had any alcohol. And they're not looking for just the total amount on the bill, but they're looking for what was actually eaten or what was consumed. So we have to be very careful with that because it is all public record, and that's has been getting several of us in trouble here last few years. This next one, absolutely common sense and 100% preventable, driving while intoxicated. We still hear about this nationwide, where chiefs exercising poor judgment either in the city vehicle or their private car wind up getting arrested for DUI, drunk driving. I try to make it a practice that if I consume any alcohol at all, that I'll have a designated driver. Clearly, it's a serious violation of every state's motor vehicle statutes, DUI, but also it's clearly a career-ending situation. Many chiefs have lost their job over this. In fact, if a chief or a command officer is arrested today, almost certainly a career-ending event for the chief. So we need to make sure that doesn't happen. Sexual harassment, hostile working environments are our next slide. And again here, we're not talking about actions of the chief or the command staff. What we're talking about is actions within the agency. Does the agency have an adequate policy? Is it clear that aggrieved employees can report what they believe to be sexual harassment or hostile working environment directly to the chief's office and or human resources? Is there training and supervision in place to prevent this? Again, as we go around the country, very often we hear stories that there's not training in a certain department or hasn't been training in several years. This is something that needs to happen every year, every other year, even if it's a canned program. As far as the chief's role here, one of the biggest mistakes a chief of police can make in this area is a failure to take a leadership role, making sure that this doesn't happen as far as prevention, and then dealing with it very sternly, very fairly when it does happen. If the chief allows that kind of behavior to continue, certainly a career-ending event at some point. The last bullet point is very important for the chief and the command staff to always engage the adult. There are people within every agency that will hang on every word that's said, and if there's a little bit of humor displayed and it's perhaps off color, that clearly will come back to haunt you at the wrong time. So I always tell people that I'm working with, always engage the adult. Our next category, inability to be a team player, especially applies to the new chief of police. As the new chief, you have to be able to work with department members, community leaders, and city department managers. As the new employee, you're expected to meld into that team, become part of that team. Sometimes that takes some extra effort. As I've often said, if you're not melding with that team and you're the new person, the manager may look at you as the problem. So that's clearly an issue that you need to address both as the new chief and certainly throughout your career in that organization. If you can't be a team player, ultimately it's going to cause morale problems. It may be the reason for a vote of no confidence. So what I always emphasize is that the chief needs to be proactive, needs to take a very active role in trying to be the point of the organization when it comes to teamwork, stressing teamwork, both on duty and off, engaging in appropriate social events, setting up opportunities for agency to work together, making sure different units work together, but viewing this as a proactive position. The chief also has to be able to relate with peers in other organizations and with the community. As the head of an agency, clearly there'll be other organizations in the community that want to interact with the chief and feel that the chief will be representative of that department. I guess the bottom line, the best way to put this part of the conversation in perspective is the chief has to genuinely care about the community and genuinely care about his or her people. This category, sexual misconduct, does apply to the chief and the command staff. Clearly, this is a category where your actions are under the microscope. I find it far better to be a family role model. Most of us in these positions, it's taken many, many years for us to get into the chief's role, and far better to be a family role model, set the tone early on. Absolute cardinal rule here is to not date subordinates. As we often say, nothing good will come of that, and if somebody thinks that they can do that in secret, it's always not the case. It will virtually always come out with career-ending consequences, a very, very dangerous situation. The final part of this is this career-ending thing we talked about. For some reason, it's been my experience around the country as I talk to fellow chiefs that when somebody aspires to and becomes chief of police, they certainly are given more opportunities to increase their social life, and we have to understand that those situations can be career-ending. It seemed like a fun thing to do at the time, but later can have disastrous consequences if you have any type of inappropriate relationship with your subordinates. So can't stress that enough. Theft is the next category to talk about. I always tell administrators and commanders that you have to be overly honest. Obviously, all police officers need to be honest, but for command staff and chiefs, they need to be what I call overtly honest. Set a very strong tone early in their administration that any type of theft, gratuities, any reduction in costs for them are just unacceptable. There also seems to be at times a misunderstanding of what borrowing is. One of the famous stories I've heard around the country is a chief in a different state borrowed a hunting rifle that was used in a suicide case that the department was holding for safekeeping to be used during hunting season, and brought it back. Is that theft? Theft of service using that weapon? I maintain that it is, and we have to be extremely careful of that. Another example would be using a city vehicle for a personal use, such as an example that came from another state as well, where a chief had a trailer hitch installed on his department vehicle to tow his boat, clearly outside the acceptable parameters for use of that vehicle. So we have to be very careful we don't fall into any of those categories, as they also will have disastrous results. Evidence and property is an area that's cost many chiefs and executives their jobs. This is often due to having an inadequate policy, also an inadequate oversight program. I maintain that a very formalized inspection system is necessary with a minimum of 4 quarterly internal inspections and 1 annual external inspection. We have forms developed for that. If anybody's interested, please contact me offline. Be glad to send you some sample forms. All of those inspections need to be documented. Again, it's absolutely critical that you can control what goes into your evidence vault and that it is purged correctly and that there are adequate audit mechanisms in place. If evidence turns up to be missing and the agency doesn't find it in an inspection but it's found out later, again, there can be disastrous results for the executive. So it's important that we take all the steps necessary to ensure that that is adequately protected. One rule of thumb here is if you are a new chief of police, never take over somebody else's problems without an audit. So one of your first actions should be auditing the evidence room. Waiting for our next category. Poor policy and procedure manual. This is one of our Achilles heels. This is a tough one for agencies of our size to maintain, and that's keeping our department manuals up to date. But it's absolutely crucial that we do this. And I think we need to start with the high liability policies first. We need to review those annually. As an example, I think it's important to know when a police officer needs to wear his or her hat, but I think having a contemporary, current pursuit policy is much more important. A current use of force policy is much more important. So those high liability directives need to be reviewed annually and continuously updated. A rule of thumb, how often should we look at policies? I think for small agencies, a good concept here is that a policy needs to be reviewed and or reissued once a month. That'll give you 12 a year starting with high liability, and if you look at 3 years, which I think is a reasonable amount of time, and time passes quite quickly, as we all know. In 3 years we'll have 36 policies reissued or updated. I think that's an excellent start. There's many private vendors out there that we can buy policies from. We can also borrow policies from other agencies that we like, but having our own policy manual up to date is absolutely critical. If not, it will come back to haunt all of us, especially in the high liability cases, lawsuits, and internal discipline. Hard to discipline somebody if your policy manual doesn't expressly show that that type of behavior is prohibited. Fair Labor Standards Act is our next category here. This has been a problem for many chiefs, many commanders around the country. It's fairly complex, but in a nutshell, it's a case out of San Antonio, Texas. I think we're all familiar with that. That says that in the public sector, if you're going to work and have an employee work overtime, they need to be compensated. What I try to impress upon police administrators is that they have to have a knowledge of FLSA issues and what is a violation, especially in the area of overtime. We need to monitor that. We need to make sure that we're applying the overtime correctly. There is no longer such a thing known as volunteering in an area in the police department. Virtually everything needs to be compensated today. The other part of this that can be quite problematic is inadequate supervisory training in Fair Labor Standards Act issues. Supervisors need to know this as well. Most cities today have an HR policy that's in compliance with FLSA, but both the city policy and department policy need to be in sync. Supervisors need to have an understanding of this and apply these rules fairly. This can be very expensive. If an employee sues by federal law, they can go back 3 years if the judge feels that it's egregious, and an employee can receive back pay to include attorney's fees. So we want to make sure that we are compensating our employees fairly, and again, pursuant to FLSA.